I am Kendra Harder. I am the Saskatoon composer that will be leading this class. We are live streaming here from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respects to the Cree and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So with that, we are going to begin with a little icebreaker poll kind of thing. So I'm going to be putting up some questions here, and I want you guys to guess when you think this was said. So the first quote that we have here is, "She was nothing. She was just a wife." Oh, here we go. Here come all the answers. All right. We're getting a lot. About 28% are saying 1986. Next in the lead is 1883, 1904. 1752 is near the end. Okay, so the answer is 1986. All right, isn't that, yeah. Wow, okay. Next question. Moderate learning becomes a lady, but not scholarship. A girl who has read her eyes red deserves to be laughed at. Oh, this is really cool seeing all the polls come in. Okay, so the most votes that we're getting are for 1812. But the actual answer is 1762, and it was said by none other than Moses Mendelssohn, the grandfather of Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn. Right? Great. All right, and final question. Oh, yeah, there we go. Oh, well, she's pretty feisty. We gotta figure out how to rein her in. Oh, come on, no one's going for 429 BCE. All right, yes, we've got actually a bit of a fight between all of the other answers, but the answer is in fact 3 years ago in 2015 that was said, right? Okay, so that's our little icebreaker. So as we can see, that the negative attitudes towards women, or even just, particular types of attitudes towards women, it's not just a thing of the past. Any sort of progress that we've made, it's kind of got ebbs and flows. A lot of progress was met with kind of misogynistic backlash. And it's sort of like progress in anything, right? We even see it with, with Black people in America, right? We had the Civil War, and there were some great things that happened, but then there's the Jim Crow laws and whatnot. Anyway, that's actually for week 3. So back to the women. So where are the women? Why don't we know about them? So to begin, I want to look at scholarship. And the reason I want to look at scholarship is because that's how we get to know about history. If nobody had written about Bach, we wouldn't even know about Bach. Oh, someone wants to know about the other quotes. So in all honesty, to protect the identities of the people who said those modern quotes is something I'll do. And to be fair, the one quote, I don't know who said it. But yeah, so I really only know the only one I feel comfortable sharing is the one of Moses Mendelssohn, because he is long dead. The other gentleman could be still alive. Sorry, Matt's texting me some questions here. Anyway, so we're talking about scholarship. So how do we even get to know about persons from history? And a lot of that is kind of via documents. So we're looking at letters, correspondence between people. We're looking at publications such as music reviews, concert advertisements. In musicology, so study of music particularly, we look at scores, whether those are published scores or manuscripts, that being the originals written by hand, and also even people's personal journals, because they save those and those get passed on. So if that's how we get to know about persons, historical persons, then why is there still a lack of women? Surely they wrote letters, and yeah, we do know that they wrote music in their scores. And so that's where sociology starts to take a very important role in this, because we've got the cultural bias going on there, the whole idea of us being the gentler sex. And so some of those documents might just not have been kept or maintained because who cares? It was just a woman. More than other reasons we don't even have those documentations is even just like socializations. You know, we're supposed to be a mother or a wife or, you know, a nun or something like that. So these are issues that kind of encompass the whole thing. But even so, there are women who were successful musicians and composers, and we do have some of those documents, but they were still met with very harsh critiques. And the general view was that women could not create, so therefore they could not compose. They didn't have the logic that they needed. They were too emotional, or they weren't the right kind of emotional to be able to write. And so, so a lot of times when these women who were the successful women who did have that support of a couple contemporaries, when they passed on, nobody really cared, so they didn't maintain the scores or pass them on, and they just sort of got lost to history to us. So sorry, I jumped all over my notes. I'm so sorry. So anyway, so we're back to them as why women weren't even necessarily allowed to compose. So a lot of these views have been reinforced with superficial views of what denotes a good composer. And we see this a lot, especially at like the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And a lot of the critiques are, well, they didn't write a symphony or an opera, so you can't be a good composer if you didn't write these. Like, this is the pièce de résistance if you're going to be a composer. They'd also be critiqued for not writing progressive music or for not being leaders of change in musical style. But how were they supposed to write progressive music if they weren't being given the opportunities to write or to have their music performed? Because a lot of the time, that's when you can make changes and you can hear things more and get a better understanding of how your music works and work on it. Additionally, they just didn't have the resources to write those symphonies and those operas, because that needs a lot of financial means and lots of support. And so a lot of those types of questions aren't the ones that have been being discussed when we talk about musicology. Like, they just look at the documents and the very sort of superficial things. But one scholar put forth sort of this proper climate that was needed for a creative artist production and participation in society. So what that is you need access to education, financial stability. You need time to write. Because, I mean, yeah, you're looking after kids. You don't really have time. Encouragement, acceptance by society, and then survival of creation. And then I feel like it has this sort of backwards loop on itself, right? So if the creations survive, that means that there is an acceptance by society, and then that can give more encouragement, which then can give more time for a person to write, and financial stability. And then you've got these, and then back up we go. They have access to education. They can get and so there we go. It's that loop that's just going. So, feminist musicological scholarship. Try saying that 5 times fast. Feminist musicology is a very recent field of study, actually. It really only took off in the 1980s. So, you know, if we're wondering why there isn't a lot of this passed on, it's kind of just because the focus hasn't really started until recently. But prior to the 1980s, there were a few one-off publications, but not very much. One of the first publications on women in music was from 1880 by a George Upton. And the book isn't so much about women as composers, but more as women as muses or as family members of great composers. They would talk about them being musicians, but again, it was not a very good look at women in music. Otherwise, a lot of textbooks might have had one or two lines about women, namely Clara Schumann, or if they were looking at modern avant-garde music, maybe Pauline Oliveros, if I'm saying that right, sorry. So really, early musicology really studied and favored men. So we get to the 1980s and we're starting to get publications. People are starting to do the research. And some really important books came out of the 1980s, one of which I actually have right here, Women Making Music, by Jane Bowers and Judith Tick. I picked this up at the Saskatoon Public Library. Thank you, SPL. Yeah, and it's filled with great essays that explore a lot of the sociological issues. And then another really exciting one that I have here from the library, although it's a second edition, but it's an historical anthology of music by women put together by James Briscoe. And why I really want to mention that James is because a lot of the time the field has been, oh, well, you're not a woman, so why are you looking at that field? No. Anyone can be interested in looking at music by women. That is really important. So this anthology, it has scores, biographies, small essays about 35 female composers. And the scores is really exciting because if you're trying to teach about music, it's really nice to have scores to show your students. It's good to have recordings if you can. In the 1980s, good luck finding recordings of female composers. But still, these scores were very exciting. It made more access to these sorts of things, and also usable modern ones. I'm actually just going to pull up a little bit of one of these, one of the pieces I was looking at. How do I do this? Start share. So this right here. So one of the things that we look for is usable modern scores to put into anthologies, because this is a very interesting score when we think of looking at historical music and historical practice. But for sort of a beginning musician or even like early university, this is not an easy thing to just read at, look at, and understand what's going on. Like even right here, right, we've got a soprano clef, and then here we've got a tenor clef, and they're not even barred together. It kind of throws you off, but they are being played at the same time. Okay, so that, yeah, there's that anthology. But so because of that work that was undertaken in the 1980s, that laid the groundwork for further research and some professional recordings. And so we are seeing more books coming out, more anthologies. There are more classes. There's more women in textbooks. But we actually still have a ways to go. A textbook that I used just a couple years ago, out of 203 excerpts, only 11 were by women. And I have just kind of a rough guide to opera. And inside of that, there are 0 women. Sexist attitudes towards women as musicians and composers, they still exist. Sometimes their music isn't really taken seriously. In the modern composition world, we will do competitions where you submit scores, and then you might get another commission out of that, or get your music played. And what they've started doing is they've done what's called blind submissions. So you don't put your name or where you were born or the year you were born, nothing like that. So it's just, they're just looking at the music, and they do this as a way to sort of curb their natural biases towards men and like against women, or for that matter, persons of color. So like, it's good that they're doing that, but it's ridiculous that it needs to be done. Actually, to that note, I've got this great quote in this book by Kaya Ceriejo that I think is a great way to just kind of sum up this little bit and launch us then into talking about the different composers here. It's kind of ridiculous. I feel that we should speak about my music and not of me being a woman. Yet later in the interview, after reflecting on the obstacles female composers continue to face in the 21st century, she concedes, maybe we then should talk about it, even if it seems so unbelievable. You know, half of humanity has something to say also. Thank you, Kaya Seriejo. So let's start talking history, women, that sort of thing. The two women that we're going to talk about today are, they're quite exceptional. Like just because of being able to create the careers that they had in their time periods, but also because they wrote across a great breadth of genres. A huge critique that we hear often about female composers is that, oh, they only wrote for lieder or for piano and whatnot. But these women, they wrote across so many genres: opera, concerti, the solo stuff as well. And they both even had a greater breadth than that of some of their male contemporaries, which is actually very, very exciting. So like, hats off to these two women. So we will be talking about, from the Baroque era, Élisabeth-Claude Jacquet de la Guerre. And then also in the classical era, we will talk about Mariana Martinez. So as we can hear from the words Baroque and classical, we are not running down all of history. Yes, Hildegard of Bingen is very important, and a lot of the music made in convents, but it's so hard to choose because they're also amazing. So this is where we are. So a lot of the music sort of pre the Baroque era, especially for women, would have been written in convents and also in their homes. So where were the jobs? If you were a musician or a composer in the past, where were the jobs? How did you get work? How did you write? So some big ones were at court, in the service of kings and princes, or you might have a patron, somebody from the nobility, pardon. And so these people would fund your work, they would fund your life, they would pay you. And it costs a lot of money to launch like operas and whatnot. There's also work as performers, so you could be an instrumentalist or a singer. You might be employees at court or in noble households. Another really important one that you see a lot of the time talked about is organists in churches. So like in Notre Dame, for example, so they would be playing organ at Mass. So none of these positions were available to women, except for singing in opera eventually, which we will touch on that in a bit here. So then where was music made? Where did women write music? So to set the scene, we are actually just going to go ahead and talk about 17th century France, because that is where Elizabeth is. So there, if you were making music, you might be a noble woman who was playing the lute or the harpsichord for yourself. It would be solo. You might be accompanying yourself while you sing. And this pastime was actually considered a very suitable accomplishment for a young lady. Doubtless playing the lute or the harpsichord was an asset in procuring a husband. Also of note is that the lute and harpsichord were considered proper for a lady to play. You really shouldn't be playing stringed instruments such as the viol or the double bass, because I guess you sat differently, or maybe you held something, so then you were straining a muscle. I don't know. I don't see why that's a bad thing. But yeah, so there was instruments that were okay for a lady to play. But now women of a lesser rank, they could actually be encouraged to make a profession out of singing, particularly with the rise of popularity of opera in France at the time, in the 1600s. And in France, these opportunities were more pronounced because there was a need for female singers. So if we go back in the centuries, the higher voice parts were not sung by women, but were in fact sung by what we call the castrati. So young boys, they would have these beautiful, high, pure voices. And in order to try to maintain these beautiful, high voices, they would be castrated as young boys before they hit puberty, in hopes of retaining that high voice, and then they could make huge careers out of it. This only sometimes worked. But yeah, it was still being practiced in Italy in the 1600s. And actually, I think the last castrati died somewhere, I want to say early 1900s, or maybe late 1800s. Again, it wasn't as popular come 1800s. But anyway, in France, they were not they did not have the castrati in the 1600s. They abhorred the castrati. And I'm not sure if it was because they detested the practice or because it was an Italian practice. They kind of didn't really like the Italians. Anyway, moving on. So 17th century France was a great place for a female musician. There was singing school for young women. There was the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis. And that was for a while presided over by Madame Maintenon, who was one of the mistresses of Louis XIV and a contemporary of another mistress, Madame de Morspin, who actually is very important in the story of Elizabeth. A young woman could also certainly advance as a musician if she was brought into the service of a noblewoman at court. And there she would be able to play, perform, and often compose for the noblewoman, and if she was lucky, for the king. But it must be emphasized, though, that this is not the same thing as a court composer. If anything, the noblewoman was more of a patron to the young lady. So now we must talk Élisabeth-Claude Jacquet de la Guerre. So she was born in 1665 and she died in 1729. And she is one of my absolute favorites that I learned about. She is so cunning and smart, and she found ways to get her music published and to be a musician in France. She worked in this male-dominated field, but she made it work for herself. So that's why we really stand for Elizabeth in this house. Also, she worked in the court of King Louis XIV, which to me is kind of fascinating. I don't know, maybe blame it on Leonardo DiCaprio, Man in the Iron Mask. I don't know. I very much get excited about all things Versailles. So to that end, let's give you a little bit something else to look at for a bit here. Because we're going to talk Versailles for a little bit. Share. Where did that go? Okay, do you guys see the Palace of Versailles? I hope you see the Palace of Versailles. So here we go, Versailles. So this was built in the time of King Louis XIV. Oh, I've got a raised hand here. What's going on? Matt might be able to help me with that. Sorry, me and technology are not always friends. Okay, so yeah, here's the Palace of Versailles, built during King Louis's reign. It was built, à tous les gloires de la France, which is written on one of the buildings there. Maybe it was built for the glory of France, or maybe for Louis, who has this beautiful sculpture in his stairwell. We can see he's got, his hand over his foot over the goddess. We can see how much he thinks of himself. Let's go back to this. That's prettier. So Versailles was the center of everything in those days. Government, society, the arts. Louis loved and adored entertainments of all kinds. And so there was non-stop entertainment. His policy was to keep the nobility occupied and amused so that they didn't have the time, energy, or inclination to stir up any trouble. So, okay. So this is kind of the world that Jacquet is living in. And I just think it's important to touch on those things just to sort of get context, because it's very different from what we're used to. So born March 17th, 1665 on Ile Saint-Louis. Ile Saint-Louis is a little island in the River Seine inside of Paris. And originally, actually, well, not originally, but just a couple decades before Elizabeth's time, it was called Ile aux Vaches, which is literally, I think, island of cows. And so it was actually the pasture for the cows for the Notre Dame Cathedral. I thought that was kind of cool. And it was that way when her grandfather was alive. But by the time she is born, it's more like a town and there's houses and everything. So her father was Claude Jacquet. He was from a family of harpsichord builders, and it had been generations they had been doing this trade. And he was also good at playing the harpsichord. And her mother, Anne de la Touche, was also from a musical family. So the family's harpsichord trade put them really close in proximity to nobility, but they themselves were not. And the only reason I bring that up is if you weren't a nobility, if you were middle class, sort of the only way you would succeed as a musician as a woman was if you came from a musical family, because then you had a lot of that support to have you taught in those ways. So as we can see, Élisabeth definitely had that. She had two brothers, both organists, and then a sister who also worked as a musician in the court of another noblewoman in Paris. So as a part of Claude's work, he was part of this artisan web of alliances linking families and trades, facilitating business deals, and creating job opportunities. So you can already see sort of that sort of political mind is in the family of how to make work happen, how to get work. And Claude educated his sons and daughters, not just the sons, his daughters too, on how to survive and how to thrive in the world. And as we start to go through Liz's life, we're going to see, yeah, she put those practices to heart. So she played harpsichord well, and she sang well, and she was a good musician at an early age. At about 5 years old, the court records show that she played at Versailles for the king. Okay, so this bit, I gotta focus. So there's a lot of stories that put her entering the service of the king at about age 8. Others say about 12, 15, and there's a lot of debate on it. And the reason for it, I mean, the stories didn't die because Élisabeth and the king kind of put those forward because it went to the glory of King Louis if it looked like he was a person. He discovered this gem, this musical gem, and he invited her into the service of his mistress. But that's not actually what happened. Well, we don't think that's what happened. But there's a really good reason why we should try to combat this when we look at the history. This book has a great way of explaining it. So Jacquet is often represented as a child prodigy, which neatly assimilates her into some very traditional ways in which women of ability and achievement are represented. If understood as a child prodigy, then Jacquet becomes a one-off, unique, a lone genius whose gift appears as if by magic, and who can be separated from the rest of her imperfect sex. To represent Jacquet as a dazzling 5-year-old, as she is often depicted, or to talk about her in terms of the supernatural or magical world, as she was portrayed in her own lifetime, serves to diminish or distract from her status as a formidably talented, not to mention hardworking professional performer and composer. So based on from what I've read, I don't think she entered the service until she was in her teenagers. And so I kind of want us to put this story to bed because she was a great musician. It's, I hate when people are like, oh, you're so talented. And it's like, okay, but these people work hard. It's not just, given to them in a dream or something. No, they work really hard to develop their crafts. And women is the same as men. They work really hard to become good musicians. So if we look to the court records, Élisabeth doesn't appear in the court records again until 1677 at age 12. And that's where she performed a song for Louis in praise of the king. Those types of lyrics were Louis's favorites. Oh, I don't like that guy. Anyway, so in between age 5 and 12, these two court appearances, she sort of had like this long period of retreat where we believe she was studying more with her father. Anyway, regardless of the timeline, she is in the service of Louis's favorite mistress, Madame de Montespan. So the favorite mistress thing is, this is interesting. So if you were Louis's favorite, you had a lot of power. You had power to influence the king. You were the center of court, of entertainments and pleasures, or the hope and terror of the ministers. So Madame de Montespan had a lot of power at the time. She was elevated to his absolute favorite in 1674, and at the height of her power in 1677 to 78, I think they had about 5 children, and that sort of showed that she had power because they were intimate together, and they had, So that's a good place for Jacquet to sort of begin, right? She's with Louis's favorites. So while she was there, she would have worked as a harpsichordist, an organist, singer, and improviser. And in 1680, she would have made the leap to composer. And again, I just want to emphasize that Madame is a patron, and Liz did not have a royal appointment. Sorry, I said Liz. In my typing, I got really tired of typing out the full name. It says Liz. we're on a first name basis, me and Liz. Okay, so there's a lot of artists and musicians that would have depended on Madame de Montespan, and she would have even organized some chamber concerts in the king's private chambers. But anyway, so 1682, this mistress starts to fall out of favor. There was some sort of a conspiracy theory that she was involved in the murder of the king's new favorite mistress, who was a teenage Duchess of Fontage. They suspected that there was like necromancy, and she was working with this underground web of sorceresses in Paris. Truly what happened was this young lady died of complications with a miscarriage. But nonetheless, this kind of ended Montespan's favor with the king. So when I read this, I was terrified. I thought, oh, what does this mean for Elizabeth? Does that mean her career is over? Well, no. She was such a great musician that her reputation as a musician was greater than her links to the Duchess, or not the Duchess, beg pardon, the mistress. But I don't know when she left the service of Madame de Montespan. I didn't find that. But what I do know for sure, though, is that in 1684, she married Marianne Laguerre, and so she would no longer have been in the service of Madame at that point. She married in 1684. And this usually spelled the end of the career of a composer or a professional musician, because now they were dedicated to the house, to the home, to being a wife. But not so for Jacquet. She kept both of her surnames sort of as a musical advert. And it was sort of, I like to call it a sign of determination of her will to continue as a composer. So even though she had lost her most powerful patron, Louis XIV is still alive and well, and was a fountain of plenty. So in 1687, Elizabeth publishes her first collection of music, Les Pièces de Clavecin, Livre 1. So that's pieces for the harpsichord. And so it was published through the royal authority, which was the only way. Like if you did not have Louis's blessing, you did not get published. And so all of her pieces that she publishes for the rest of her life have these dedications in them to King Louis. Oh, beg pardon. And she always signs them this way: from the most humble, the most obedient, the most faithful, the most obliging servant and subject, Élisabeth Jacquet. So she was always just playing to his vanity. She was always just making him feel good, and he fell for it. And so she kept getting published, which I think is amazing. This is a great publication. It was in her opera ballet that she wrote in 1691. Oh, and that date is important because that is the year that Montespan officially left court. So even though she worked for Montespan, she's still doing okay. Louis still likes her music. Okay, this is her dedication to King Louis. Those previous signs of my devotion, so her other publications, seemed to me insufficient, and I longed for an opportunity to express my devotion publicly. This is what led me to compose this ballet for the theater. Women have already given excellent pieces of poetry therein, which have been most successful, but so far, none has attempted to set a whole opera to music. And I take that advantage for my undertaking, that the more extraordinary it is, the more worthy it is of you, sire, and the more it authorizes the liberty I take in presenting this work to you. Like, what a gal. We love Jacquet. Okay, so we're now going to actually listen to some music because that's the best part. So this piece I'm going to show you here, it was published in 1707, and it's from her Pièces de Clavecin qui peuvent se jouer sur le violin. And so it's harpsichord pieces which can be played on the violin. But they're not pieces, they're sonatas. And this is actually a big deal. Sonatas are Italian. This is an Italian music form. Louis does not like Italian things. But he liked Jacquet's music so much, he was okay with this. And there is a little bit of a French side put into it. The second movement that we'll listen to, which is the third movement, it sounds a bit like one of the dances that was at traditional French courts, the gavotte. And the French music is really tied into the dance, because they would, of course, dance. Dance was very popular in France. So that's really neat. But the first piece I'm going to show, which is the second movement, it is gorgeous. It is beautiful. And it sounds a little bit more Italian, but again, she fuses her own language and just writes these beautiful pieces. So the second sonata in the full publication, it's the more lively in the set, and they all really show off the versatility of the violin. Ooh, which at the time was actually kind of like a pauper's instrument. So these sonatas and any kind of work sort of like this, they helped bring up the status of the violin in France. Okay, so let us start share. The whole thing, share computer sound. Perfect. Okay. So this is the second movement of the Sonata number 2 in D major for violin and basso continuo. Probably noticing there's a lot of notes in here that you're hearing that you're not seeing on the paper, and that's a part of the French performance class. A lot of this is on the knowledge of how you read ornaments, different notes and whatnot. And then these numbers here, they just refer to the chords that are being played above these notes. And so in a sense, it's kind of like a modern chord chart, very improvisatory. Very cool. And here comes the third movement. This one reminds me of the gavotte. Isn't that great? Yes. Okay. So, okay. So now we're going to move from one court of power to another court of power. And we are going to move to the Imperial Court of Vienna in the 18th century. So during our next composer's time, Mariana, Empress Maria Theresa reigned from 1740 to 1780, and the last 15 years she shared the power with her son Joseph II. And so this was the golden age of music in Vienna. You could attend a concert or an opera almost every day. But like most of the musical performances took place privately in people's homes. They were called salons or musical gatherings. And so these would range from, just some very amateur players playing some solos to even grand scale symphonies in people's homes. And so a symphony, though, at this time, it's not like the really large orchestras we see with Beethoven and Berlioz, or even today. It was a lot more pared back, a lot less instruments, but still, like, that's a lot of people to fit into your house. But a lot of the homes of the wealthy people who hosted these salons, they had room for several hundreds of guests. But nonetheless, they were still quite friendly and intimate gatherings, and musicians could perform new compositions, they could perform with new people. It was a very vibrant and just very warm musical scene. So Mariana Martinez was one of the most accomplished and prolific female composers of that century. And she was one of the very few women who composed for grand scale music. So she was born in Vienna in 1744. And she was born to Niccolo Martinez, and he was born in Naples to a Spanish father. And Niccolo was a high-ranking official in the papal embassy to the imperial court. He was the master of ceremonies, which is like a modern-day chief of staff. And her mother's name was Maria Teresa, not the same as the empress. And she was one of 6 children. She had 4 brothers and 1 sister. Her eldest brother, I'm only sharing this because I'm a huge library geek and I just think this is so cool. So Joseph, he worked in the library system in Vienna, and he recatalogued the court library and the imperial coin collection, which I think is kind of cool. But he also tutored the empress's children, including future Emperor Joseph II. So you're probably starting to notice that this is quite a well-to-do family. So they lived in what was called the Michaeler house, and this was attached to Michaeler Kirche, which was the court chapel, which was just outside the imperial palace. So this was a nice place. So these homes, this is kind of cool. So they were these apartment houses, I guess, and on the first floors there was these roomy, luxurious flats, like not the ground floors, but like lower floors. And then the higher you went up in floors, the size and accommodations of the flats declined, as did the social classes of the inhabitants. The attics were then rented out to poorer tenants. And who lived in the Martinez attic, you might wonder? Joseph Haydn. Poor musician living in an attic. Anyway, but yeah, they lived on like they lived in the big flat. So on the 3rd floor, just above them, poet laureate of the Austrian Empire, Pietro Torpassi, lived there, and he is called Metastasio. That is a hard one to say. That's a tongue twister. And he was a family friend to Niccolo when they had lived in Naples. So he's actually a big part of Mariana's life. He was like a mentor, and he helped with all the children's their careers once their father had died in 1764. So Metastasio, he's a big supporter of Mariana. I'm going to call him Metzi from now on because that's a hard name to say. Anyway, so as we can see, Mariana is very well connected. And this isn't to diminish her talents, but it's just to demonstrate the importance of having wealth and finances to develop as a musician and a composer, particularly as a woman, because you didn't have a lot of cards to play since your gender was an obstacle. So this actually made a very unique career for Mariana. Mariana started study at age 7, and Metzi took a lead in her musical education. He organized singing lessons for her with Nicola Porpora, who also lived in the Michaeler house. He counterpoint with the court composer Giuseppe Bono, and then he also set up some harpsichord lessons with Joseph Haydn. I think that's really cool. And Mariana would practice daily. So of course harpsichord, but she would practice composition, and this was in combination with scrutinous studies of scores by the masters at that time. So she got a lot of really good information and became a very well-crafted artisan. And she was an excellent harpsichordist and an excellent soprano singer. At the age of 17, she was summoned to play court for the Empress. And apparently, little baby Joseph II turned pages for her. And this really helped her with her reputation as an excellent musician. So yeah, while lots of female composers are really mostly known for smaller works, let us give some high worth noting too. In 1761, her fully orchestrated Mass in C was performed at the Imperial Court Parish of Saint Michel on the name day of Holy Archangel Michael at high Mass. This is a public performance. This is a big deal. So yes, yay, Mariana. Most of the works that women had performed were in private performances, and actually the majority of Mariana's work was performed privately, and that would have been at these salons and these musical gatherings, which her family and she herself hosted. So at these salons, it is very likely that Mozart attended these, and there are reports that they played duets together. And some sources suggest that Mozart's piano concerto in D major K175 was written for Martinez. So to that end, I'd really like to show a little bit of her music for keyboard, because I think that shows her talent, because she would write it so that she could play it. So we are going to look at the keyboard concerto in A major here. And so this first recording that I am going to show you, it is on period style instruments, or in tuning. So that means that, you know, we have our A440 standard tuning today. That is a whole other ball of wax that I'm not totally going to get into now. But you'll notice it more when I show you another recording of this on modern instruments. Anyway, here is the keyboard concerto in A major. Pause that there because we're running out of time. Oh, there's so much good music. And I also just want to show you a little bit of this modern instruments one, simply because, like, I like the sound of the harpsichord. It's nice and all, but the piano, it's clearer, and I feel like we just get a better sense of how of the parts of it. Maybe it's just me, but it's cool, and I think it's a nice way to also breathe some more life or bring this music back, just by having more modern. Just modern instruments playing it. So here's another performance here of it. And if you notice, I could listen to that for hours. So here we go. So let's talk a little bit more about her life. So in 1773, Mariana was the first woman to be elected into the Accademia Filarmonica di Bologna. And in its 108 years of existence, she was the first woman elected into this academy. The Academia members, they were amazed at her combination of beauty, ingenuity, nobility of expression, and astonishing correctness in composition. So on entrance into the Academy, composers were expected to create a new work. And so for this, Mariana wrote the Dixit Dominus, and it was to be given a public performance at the celebration of Saint Anthony of Padua. And so this piece is gorgeous. It is considered to be her masterpiece by modern musicologists. Like it's so good. So we're just gonna take a little look here at movement 2. So while it's playing, in the intro, the flutes play this beautiful little motif, which is then echoed in the singers afterwards. So here we go. This is movement 2. This piece is beautiful. On the Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra YouTube page, and actually even my own YouTube page, we have the playlist there, and I would highly suggest you all take time to listen to all of them. That one I think is one of my favorite pieces that I've discovered thus far. Anyway, I know we're running out of time, but this is really important because it really shows how society's views of women sort of impact a person. So we're going to go a little over, and I'm so sorry, but I can't help it. So this piece is to be performed as her induction into this prestigious academy. So great, awesome, right? But here's the thing. Martinez did not travel to Bologna to receive her reward. Every other inductee was required to appear in person. So because she didn't travel, the Dixit Dominus was never performed. And it's sadly not an isolated incident. A few years earlier, she had collaborated on some psalms with poet Saverio Mattei, and those were performed in Naples, and even the Queen of Naples was there, and she was just delighted by Mariana's work, and lots of people were, and so they were inquiring about her, and so Mattei invited her to Naples, and she did not go. Another opportunity arose later where Mattei once again invited her to Naples to work on setting some new pieces. And once again, she didn't go. And other performances took her place, and then they had their pieces published. So we're not really sure why she refused to go or didn't go, but it just seemed that she was just scared to leave Vienna, and that she would ruin what she had created. She would ruin this musical world that she had created if she traveled. I think maybe another possibility of what's influencing her was that a noble lady was not supposed to perform in public. It was unseemly for a noble woman to be a professional musician. And so throughout her whole life, she just seems to be hindered by caution and conservatism. She even has quite a self-depreciating view of her own music. About her Dixit Dominus, she calls it a product of her feeble powers. And I mean, we heard just a little bit of it there. That's not feeble, that's beautiful, that is gorgeous. Like, there's so, like, Beethoven could not write good vocal music. The vocalists said it themselves. She was a soprano, she wrote beautiful music. Anyway, but it just goes to show how much society's views can just subconsciously affect and hinder us. Like, I even think of myself, like, it took me forever to finally get myself into music composition and into going to music school, because I just felt like, oh, well, I should be an admin assistant, or I don't know, that's what ladies do. But no, these views, they get us, and we need to stop that. And we see it there with Mariana. Like, not much has changed in a couple hundred years. And it's really too bad she didn't travel. Like, imagine what more she may have accomplished if she had let go of some of that caution. Like, would we have her in the canon now? Like, would she have done that much? I don't know that she would have, because gender bias is just despicable, and we see a lot of it, especially in the next century. But there we have it. So we have the bold Élisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and then we have the kind of more conscientious Mariana. But both are amazing composers. Both are worth us talking about. And okay, we are like totally running out of time. So let us now open this up to questions. I'm not sure how Matt wants us to do this. I'll go into this little Q&A thing here. Okay, Academy. Was this a professional outlet or an educational setting for her? I believe it was professional, because you would have seen inductees such as Mozart and others like that. Like, it was a big deal to be inducted into this academy. Thanks. So, do we know much about performances of Liz's work? Who, pros or friends? That would have, for the most part, been, like, private stuff. She hosted salons herself, actually. Her own, like, actually both Mariana and Élisabeth, they had very distinguished salons, and they were quite central to the societies in which they lived, like in Vienna and Paris. And so, they would have even, Élisabeth would have performed some of her own works. So there's definitely, some more, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So it would have been, for the most part, private. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? Woo. All right. Did both of these women marry and have children? Well, you mentioned Élisabeth was married, sure. So Élisabeth did have a child, but it passed, I don't even know if it was a son or a daughter. The child passed away same year, actually, as her husband, in 1704. So she was actually a widower in her last, like, for a great part of her, I guess how we math, 13, I'm not gonna math, like a decade of her life. She was a widow, at least. And she supported herself. As for Mariana, she was not married. And I think that served her composition well. She did do some domestic, like some house things. She would have hosted the salons and done the things that were required of her in society. That's kind of all I know on that subject. Were these two composers remembered at all in centuries after the deaths, or they just rediscovered in recent decades? As for Élisabeth, I think she was more just a recent discovery, but I actually don't know that for sure. As for Mariana, she was known a little bit into the next century, but she was, a little review came out by somebody named Caroline Pilcher, and she really discredited and defamed Mariana. And so after that, she actually fell off the radar, and we lost. So then that would be sort of a more rediscovered composer. Let's see here. Which king? Oh, so we were talking about King Louis XIV, the Sun King. Yeah, sorry, I talk really fast. I apologize. How was their music poster-gated through time? I'm gonna need a dictionary. Sorry, guys. Me. Come on, Google. Could you reword your question? I am so sorry, anonymous attendee. Poster game. Google is not helping me. Let's see here. Yeah, anonymous attendee, I'm not quite sure what poster-gated means, so if you could reword your question, that'd be great. I'm looking at a dictionary and online. They're not giving me answers. Put off or postpone. Okay. So how has their music survived? I know that Jacquet's, so it would go into the possession of their families and their wills and whatnot. I didn't get any information on that with Élisabeth, but with Mariana, being that she was of high nobility, those records were probably kept and maintained somewhere. Now there was there was war in Vienna, and it's like she died shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte took possession of Austria, and they actually her and her sister ended up living in poorer conditions afterwards. So my guess is that it was, though, bequeathed to the next person. I hope I am answering people's questions. All right, anything else? His relationship with other composers of their time. Well, I mean, we look at Mariana, she would have had a great relationship with people such as Haydn and Mozart, because as we know, she would have, well, we guess, she would have played with them. And at her soirees, her big soirees that she would have hosted in, it was the 1790s, 1780s, Haydn and Mozart were coming. They were going to those, like they wanted to play with her, they wanted to hear her music, they wanted to perform themselves. As for other composers, I didn't really, that didn't really come up necessarily. With Élisabeth, anyone else who would have been in the service of Madame de Marspain, she would have naturally interacted with. Yeah, and then same with Mariana, like whoever came to those salons and whatnot. But the resources that I was reading didn't give much to that. So with more scholarship on women, will we find even more from these? Oh, I sure hope so. Oh, I sure hope so. The scholarship seems to be really expanding, and we're always kind of seeing more things and new things. Ooh, I wonder if I can find it at this exact moment. There was, there's like a timeline that somebody took the time to make. It's really cool. Here we go, timeline maestra, music.org. Oh yeah, so a great resource that sort of, that looks at a lot of these. Oh, this is on Broadway. Sorry, wrong thing, never mind. If you want to look at the history of Broadway, maestramusic.org has a history of all the women on Broadway. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot of resources out there. Yeah. Actually found it incredible that there is no plague or anything in Vienna about Mariana. They put a bunch of plaques. Sorry, COVID-19's got plague on my brain. They put a bunch of plaques for other composers. Either they lived there for 2 months or spent one night. Yeah. I also find it incredible, but I also think of, we look at the bias, and they don't care if you're not a man, you didn't get the recognition. But they should change that, right? Like we should write all of Vienna and say, give us a plaque. But I would say it's the same reason why. It's the same reasons why we haven't heard about them till now, is because because of the attitudes towards women. Liz Rameau, are you asking about the French composer Rameau? Like he would have come after her. I'll have to get back to that one. If you can rephrase your question. Is it possible more info exists that just remains unfound? I think so. I don't. Oh, it would be so neat to be a musicologist, like the people who are actually doing this work, finding the letters, looking through the libraries. Actually, one of those quotes that we talked about this from 1986 at the beginning of the class, that was from a library where somebody was trying to find more information on Fanny Mendelssohn, and like they were denying her access to see the scores. And eventually they did, and the reason they were denying her access for quite a few years was because they were waiting for the right person to come along, i.e. the right man to come and look into it. But they finally let her look at it. Yeah, so how people go about finding this stuff is fascinating to me, and finding these letters, finding these scores. And even some of the scores, I think, just trying to get them into modern notation. It'd be great if they found some more stuff like Mariana's, Elisabeth's first opera ballet. Like, that score is missing. What we have of that is, I think it's like stage directions, the dances themselves, because they would like write them out, and that is Greek to me. I don't understand those diagrams when I see them. Even like the full orchestration, like what the instruments that would have been used listed was there, but the music itself is missing. So I would like to think that more is out there. I'm very sure of that. Let's see here. You mentioned Mariana's connection with Mozart. Could you elaborate on that? Okay, so a lot of it is some hearsay from letters from people saying that Mozart was there. It is kind of a lot. When we say that this happened, we're just guessing at best. There's one person. This is great. That one of the sources that saw them playing duets together. They say that this person wasn't the most reliable source, because they talked about Mariana and somebody else being there, or like looking like they were the same age, but they were like a 10 years difference or something. And just some of the things that this particular source said weren't always very true. But still, I don't think he would get wrong that Mozart was in the room. Yeah, so it is just kind of like they see a mention in a letter, or they see a mention in that, and that's sort of how we piece those puzzles together. And that's, yeah, unfortunately only guy with that, but still cool. It's like, it's nice to imagine that that's what happened. Okay, so I was wondering about the relationship of Elisabeth and other French composers. Oh, so Lully. Lully is not too soon. He would have been in the court at around the same time as Elisabeth. And so while he was there, as we know, he was the only person writing opera. So when he died in 1782, it was kind of like, or 1682, beg pardon. Everyone must have been like, hooray, we can write opera now. But the sad truth is, there was what we call sort of the Lully effect. And because he had created sort of this French operatic tradition, so not Italian, right? That's good. His music was kind of all that opera houses wanted to do afterwards, and that's all the audiences wanted to hear. So instead of commissioning new pieces from people, they would just replay Lully. And it really hampered people from writing operas. So in, I think it's 1694, my brain, I need coffee. Elisabeth wrote an opera, and it was called Céphalée Procrée. It's one of the things I wanted to get to today, but I mean, I packed this lesson too full. And she did write an opera. It's beautiful. It's listed in the playlist. It's at the very bottom. There's a couple clips at the top, but the full thing is at the bottom if you want to listen to 2 hours of awesome Baroque opera. But it didn't have a very good reception, or even a very good review. It only had 5 or 6 performances. And so for those of you who aren't aware, opera had lots of performances, like, I want to say like 100 plus, because that's all you really had to do, right? You didn't have the movies. You couldn't re-listen to it later on your CD or your tape player. So you would go multiple times. So her opera only played 5 or 6 times, so it's kind of called a semi-failure. And just because of the harsh critiques, because it didn't sound like Lully, even though in a YouTube comment, someone's like, this sounds like Lully. And she did try to write more like Lully, so that she had a better chance of her opera being played. But nonetheless, it wasn't Lully, so it wasn't played, or maybe it was because it was a woman in the opera hall and they didn't like that. And unfortunately, she didn't write any more operas after that. But that score was published, and so we have that, and hence why we have that great recording. But as for any sort of maybe relationships between them, I don't know if they would have really crossed paths. Louis seems like I feel like him and Louis would have been very kindred spirits, very full of themselves, so he may not have noticed some young lady working with a mistress. I don't know. This is my guess. All right. Any other questions that I can attempt to answer in like 1 minute? Oh, okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening and for paying attention to me and keeping up with me. This has been great. Thank you for all the questions. Lets me talk about things that I'm like, oh, I don't have time to talk about, but now I get to talk about. This has been awesome. I will see you all next week. Thank you again so much for tuning in. Thank you again to Mark Turner, Eric Pechtow, and the SSO for putting this class on. Yeah, and I will see you all next week. Bye.